Hi, my name's Mark Warner. I am a lecturer at Northumbria University in the UK. But this paper that I'm presenting today reports on the final study that I conducted during my PhD at UCL's Interaction Centre, hence the branding of the slides. So this work is centred around the study of non-disclosures, in particular the non-disclosure of sensitive information in online social environments. What we do here is we use the case study of HIV status disclosures in dating apps used by men who have sex with men to understand how effective the prefer not to say options are in structured disclosure fields, so drop-down menus in effect. So these are quite commonly used across various different technologies. We're interested in understanding how people behaved around these initially, but then later on how effective they were. So to give a bit of background, over the past several years, most of the popular sex social apps used by MSM have introduced explicit HIV status disclosure fields into their applications. And what these do typically is allow users to disclose their status to other users via their public profiles or their semi-public profiles. So as you can see the video up on the screen, these are typically quite simple elements of a user interface, typically asking users one of two questions. The first is, what is your HIV status? And the second one typically is when we last tested, so the reporting of the last test date. So between 2017 and 2019, we conducted a number of qualitative studies actually around these fields and around these technologies. And one of the things that came out of those qualitative studies was the potential social privacy problem for people who are choosing not to disclose. And this was then explored in relation to an effect known as privacy unraveling, which I'll talk about in a short while. So what was found in those initial qualitative studies? So there was a concern that those users who were choosing not to disclose may be assumed to be hiding some undesirable quality or undesirable state, which in this context would be a HIV positive status. So what we then started to do is to explore this finding in relation to the privacy unraveling effect that was presented by Scott Peppett in a 2011 article. So what this effect suggests is that in a signaling environment, such as a dating application like Grindr, where people are signaling information to each other in order to increase their own desirability, people will disclose information about themselves even if that information is less than desirable. And the reason why they do this is to differentiate themselves from those who are holding even less desirable information. And this is effectively where this term unraveling comes from, because it unravels down to those who are holding the least desirable quality, who then arguably have no incentive to reveal. What our qualitative findings very much suggested a concern for unraveling occurring within this context around this type of information. But we were not sure whether non-disclosures were actually disadvantaging users, or whether this was just as a concern of users. And so this is very much what this study that I'm presenting today looks to explore. So how did we test this? What did we do? So we asked participants to rate a set of paired profiles. So one profile on each pair disclosed an HIV status, and then the other profile, the matched profile, had HIV status undisclosed. And the reason for using this pair design was to control for variability in other profile information. So we were presenting other profile information on these profiles, such as ethnicity and body type, preferred position, and obviously there is variability in people's preferences, and so pairing these profiles in this way allowed us to control for that. So how do we measure this? Quite simply, we asked participants to rate each profile on a 5-star scale, and then we use this as our dependent variable. So what did we test? So we had a number of independent variables in our design. The first was a design variable. So we were interested to find out whether variations in the way undisclosed information was displayed to users may impact on their perceptions around the undisclosed information. So in particular, we looked at the visibility of undisclosed information, but also how ambiguity around that undisclosed information impacted on that outcome variable. Secondly, we're interested in how disclosure norms affected perceptions. So there's been quite a bit of work in this space already, and what we were looking at is whether, for example, if disclosure of HIV status was very common, so the norm was to disclose, how this affected perceptions around non-disclosure. So if then someone wasn't disclosing, this seems a bit more unusual, and so does it have is it perceived more negatively, and then vice versa if the opposite is true. And then lastly, we were interested in how other profile information impacted on perceptions around non-disclosures. So did people use other information to help them fill in the blanks? There's been some work in this space around understanding how other or how other information may impact on the way that other information is evaluated that is not present. So there's a ban the box initiative in the US, and some research around that suggests that in the absence of criminal record information on employer application forms or employee application forms, ethnicity, for example, can be used to infer the information that is missing. So in terms of the first variable that we tested, which was design, we developed three conditions. The first was a visible condition, which replaced any non-disclosing HIV status information with a label that stated prefer not to say. The second was a hidden condition. So here, where information was undisclosed, it was completely removed from view. So you can see in this middle design. That there is now no information attribute to HIV status in the last test date. And then the Ask Me one is similar to the first one, but the label is somewhat more ambiguous. So it suggests that the person probably is willing to disclose, but just not in public. So in terms of the disclosure norms, before asking participants to rate these paired test profiles, we asked them to rate a set of priming profiles. Participants were randomly assigned to one of two groups. One group was a set of profiles where HIV status was disclosed frequently, and then the other group less frequently. At the end, we ran a prime manipulation check to see whether this was effective, and it was. And then in terms of the impact of other information, as I said before, each profile that we showed participants and asked them to rate had or included other profile information, and one of those information types was ethnicity. Most of our participants that were rating were white, and so we classified profiles that displayed an ethnicity of white as a non-minority profile, and then all other profiles as minority profiles, and then used that separation in our analysis. Okay, so what did we find? Firstly, how did design impact on our dependent variable? How did it impact on the way that participants were rating profiles? Well, from the graph, what we can see is that HIV negative profiles are rated the highest, whilst HIV positive profiles are rated the lowest, which was not unsurprising. In the visible and Ask Me conditions, the undisclosed profiles, which is this label here in orange, the undisclosed profiles sit in between these 2 points. So this suggests that partial unravelling is occurring. So we don't see undisclosed information being rated the same as HIV positive profiles, but we don't see full unravelling, but we do see this partial unravelling occurring. Certainly in these two conditions, these visible and the Ask Me conditions. What's interesting here is that in the hidden condition, we actually see no statistically significant difference between undisclosed profiles and negative and the negative profiles, which suggests that there is no unravelling occurring, in that hidden condition. So it suggests that the visibility of undisclosed information is having an impact on the level of unraveling around this information. So in terms of disclosure norms, we didn't find an effect on disclosure norms in our analysis. In the paper, we add a slight word of caution around this, with very much forced norms in our experimental design. Whilst norms are typically forming over a longer period of time and they're learned, right? We suggest further work to investigate this, perhaps selecting people based on the norms that they already hold within the dating environments that they're currently in, and exploring it that way. So we didn't find an effect, but we do add a sort of a word of caution around this finding. When we explored inferences in our additional analysis, we find that non-minority profiles, so profiles displaying an ethnicity of white, and there was no partial unraveling occurring in the hidden condition, which was the same as the finding that we were showing before. However, for undisclosed minority profiles, we now see partial unraveling occurring across all design conditions, whereas before we only saw this in the visible queue and the asked-me queue. So what this suggests is that ethnicity is perhaps being used by participants to help them infer the missing information. So in the absence of HIV status information, ethnicity is then, and perhaps other profile information is being used to infer that information that's missing. So what it suggests is that the hidden design, which actually is a design that is commonly used across these applications at the moment, is effective, but it may not be effective for all users. So it may be disadvantaging certain users. Okay, that's me. Thank you for listening. That's it. But what next? Well, we'd really like you to read our paper. This was just a very sort of a quick overview of the experimental design and the results. We'd also like to just raise some questions that we've included in the paper, which would hopefully sort of spur on some future work in this space. One of them is around the generalizability of our findings. Does it generalize to other contexts? So are these findings very specific to dating applications? And then how do these findings generalize to other information types? And HIV is relatively somewhat unique. It's extremely stigmatized still. And so we don't know how these findings may generalize to other perhaps less still sensitive but less stigmatized information types. And what we know now, we ask the question as to how you effectively design for non-disclosures. So if you were to create recreate these fields, how do we do that effectively? Without disadvantaging users, and in particular without disadvantaging minority users. Thank you very much.